Hey guys, what's up? This is the channel. This is me. I'm the droneographer, and I'm going to be teaching you guys some key concepts with your photography editing. And whether you're a beginner or you're a pro, I'm just going to be able to help you understand what you're doing when you're in a software like Lightroom and what it's doing to your pictures. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So guys, the first thing you gotta understand when you're editing your pictures is what a picture actually is. Basically, there's all these millions of dots. Normally, could be thousands, could be hundreds. Any dot, number of dots, doesn't really matter. It still makes up a picture. But what they are is they're basically just little dots that we call pixels, and they're all different colors. And what these pixels do is they create the illusion of an image on your screen. So what happens when you go into Lightroom, for example, and you adjust your highlight slider? You're basically taking all the brightest pixels in that image and they're brightening them, or they're lowering the brightness on them. And same thing with like your exposure, except your exposure is kind of the whole thing. But don't worry, we'll get into that later. So, next thing you gotta understand are things like resolution and your aspect ratio. So what this means is basically if you have like a 4,000 pixel by 3,000 pixel image, if you see that anywhere, it's a pretty common one to see. It's basically saying that you got your width is 4,000 pixels wide and then your height is gonna be 3,000 pixels wide. And when you, that fell. Anyways, when you multiply those together, you're gonna be getting 12 million, and that's where that 12 megapixel comes in. So the next thing is aspect ratio. What exactly is aspect ratio? So we'll go back to our 12 megapixel image example again, and we have our 4,000 by 3,000. Basically, aspect ratio is the ratio of the width to the height. So if we have 4,000 pixels on the width and we have 3,000 on the height, basically it's going to be taking those and dividing them, making them a fraction, and that simplifies down to 4/3. So that is a 4:3 aspect ratio image. Okay guys, now that you understand the basics of photography and how pictures actually work and what they are, let's start getting into the juicy stuff. How you edit your pictures, what concepts you're going to need to know to take your pictures and actually understand what you're doing when you take them to Lightroom. So guys, this might cut you off by surprise, but the first step actually isn't anything to do with Lightroom or anything like that. It's how you're shooting your pictures. So generally when you're taking pictures, photography, anything like that, you have two main file types, and that's going to be your JPEGs and your RAWs or DNGs. So the differences are JPEG just basically takes little information but makes the information on that image look really nice. What RAW or DNG does is it takes in as much information as it can, but the image normally doesn't turn out as good looking until you go into post-production like Lightroom and you have a RAW file. You can basically go in there and adjust setting, whereas if you take that setting and go into Lightroom and adjust it with a JPEG file, it might not turn out as well because you don't have as much information. So you can't make as drastic edits. You're very limited compared to RAW files. The only downside of RAW, I guess, would be the file size is generally a lot bigger. But when you export them, you normally export them back to JPEG because you're not going to be editing them and it just looks better. Okay guys, let's get the fun started now. I'm going to be talking about Lightroom, the basic functions of it, and what you can do in it. So the first thing you need to know is exposure. What is exposure and what it's doing to your image? So exposure is really the most basic way to edit your image as far as light goes. It's basically you drag it up, it's going to make the whole image brighter. You drag it down, the whole image gets darker. Next, we have more complicated things when it comes to light adjustment. So we generally have our contrast, our lights, which would be our highlights, our darks, which would be our shadows, and our absolute darks, which are blacks, our absolute whites, which are just whites. So first off, let's start off with our whites and our blacks. So our whites are basically the most brightest part in our image, the absolute brightest. What this is basically if you take a picture of like a sunset, it's going to be that sun. As far as the blacks go, it's complete opposite. Whenever you take a picture and you have a dark part in the image, the darkest parts are going to be considered the blacks. But even though you are just adjusting the whitest parts and the darkest parts of your image, you're still going to be adjusting the whole image. It might sound contradictory, but when you adjust, like let's say the whites, it's going to mainly adjust the brightest parts in your image, but it'll still have a small effect on the rest of the image itself. Next, we can talk about our shadows and our highlights. So what are these? Our shadows and our highlights are basically our whites and our blacks, but just not as extreme. So the shadows are the darkest parts of your image besides the blacks. Your highlights are the brightest parts of your image besides the whites. When you go into Lightroom and edit your shadows, it's going to be bringing the dark parts of your image either up or down based on what you want. And when you edit the highlights, it's going to do the same with the brighter parts of your image. So next we have contrast. So this is a very simple one. It's basically the difference between your lights and your darks, and generally it's going to affect your colors a little bit. I've seen when I edit my images and I max out the contrast, the differences in colors are a lot more extreme, just as the differences in darks and brights are just as extreme. The cool thing about contrast is you can adjust that contrast slider, and that's just kind of like an all-in-one, almost like a shortcut. But you can then go into your lights, which would be your highlights, your whites, and then your darks, which are your blacks and shadows, and manually adjust that contrast to fine tune it. So you really should go into Lightroom thinking about it as your exposure, then your contrast, and then you go in there and fine tune everything just to get that final crisp and clean edit. So guys, next let's start talking about color when you go into Lightroom. So guys, the most basic form of color manipulation in Lightroom is your white balance. What is your white balance? It's basically the temperature or tint in your image as a whole. So if you were to go out on a very sunny day and take an image, by default, it's probably going to have a very orange and warm white balance. If you were to go out when it's raining, cloudy, it's going to be more blue and cold. The tint, on the other hand, adjusts your image from the greens to more of like a pink or purple. And what most people like to do is they'll go in and adjust their temperature, and that'll give them a base image to work with, and then they go in there and fine tune it with their tint. You can mainly go into Lightroom and adjust these yourself. And just like I said before, if you have a raw file, you're gonna be able to do a lot more with those images because you're gonna have a lot more color information to work with. The next thing I'd like to talk about is your vibrancy and saturation. This is the next most basic thing you can do when you're working with color in Lightroom. You may be asking, what is vibrance? What is saturation? What does that mean? It's basically how intense those colors are, how they show on your screen. And when you hear someone saying, oh, that's oversaturated, that's generally meaning that there's a lot of color and it really needs to be toned down because it's overpowering the image. And when you have it oversaturated, it's gonna look like this. And when you have it undersaturated, it's gonna look like this. And you can actually go in there and turn that saturation slider all the way down to 0, and it's gonna take all the color out of your image and make it a monochrome image. So you may be asking, why don't I just use saturation? What's the difference? And to answer that, it's quite simple, as vibrance isn't as strong as saturation. And what a lot of people like to do, including myself, is go in there and adjust the vibrance and turn that up. And then you can even go in there and adjust the saturation by turning it down. And this makes a really nice, clean looking color in your image, and it's just gonna look better overall. Okay guys, so for the last thing today, we're gonna be talking about cropping your image. This is pretty much the last step to editing your pictures and taking them and making them look perfect. So you may be asking yourself, what is cropping an image doing? It's basically going in there and changing the size, how big it is, and also the more important thing is it allows you to focus your compositions on your subjects and your image. Another important thing to remember with cropping is the rule of thirds. What is the rule of thirds? It's basically when you're editing and you're cropping your image down, you're going to be seeing a grid, and you want your subjects and your image to be on that crosshair on the grid. And as you can see, it looks a lot better when you're using the rule of thirds to whereas you're not. The image just looks better. It might not seem as like an obvious thing to do when you go out there and take your picture or you're cropping it in post-production, but it really does just add that nice touch to your image. Okay guys, that's gonna wrap this video up today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave any questions or concerns in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. And now I would love to see what you guys can create. So go out there and get creative.